Yeah, this is our second webinar for the fall for Saturate. We're doing 5 webinars themed around the Church of the Future, is what we're calling it. So a couple weeks ago, my friend Daniel Yang from Send Institute kicked us off as we started by considering just the North American Church of the Future. And if you're just joining us today, here's where we're going with this. We're considering things that are changing because of COVID, but really we're considering things that are bigger than COVID, that COVID just might be shining a light on. And there are church leaders and researchers and missiologists and even everyday followers of Jesus who see COVID as simply pointing toward a trajectory that our culture and our churches have already been on since long before COVID. And so this fall, we're asking what can we do and what must we do as we respond and as we prep for the future. And as God has given churches an opportunity to do a hard reset that COVID is providing. So one of the ways that North America would be wise to answer those questions are to glean wisdom from sisters and brothers across the world whose cultures have already walked through similar trajectories. And that brings us to today. And I've been personally blessed for many years by the work of Stuart Murray, especially his writing around the church and mission in a post-Christendom world. And he's specifically written from a UK context where he joins us from today. So Stuart, welcome, brother.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Thank you. He's Stuart's an urban church planter. He planted in London. Since then, he has continued to train church planters with an organization called Urban Expression. He's a great writer, a great thinker. He's a professor. And he can share a little bit more about who he is. But he and I got to talk last week, and I'm thrilled to continue the conversation that he and I had, and I'm thrilled for folks to get to join in as leaders across North America and beyond learn from Stuart Murray. So I'll pray, and then I'll give Stuart the floor. He and I will have a bit of a chat after that, but feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function that Zoom so graciously gives us, and we'll spend the last bit answering whatever questions you have. So let me pray for us. Father, I thank you for today. I thank you that, as Stuart and I were mentioning before, that the grace of technology that allows us to chat with folks across the ocean and glean from the global church and learn together as the church in North America and the church in Europe and the church beyond. Thank you for the grace of getting to not have to forge new paths with zero guidance. So I thank you for Stuart. I thank you for his experience and his wisdom and his knowledge and his writing. And as we prayed before we started, God, I pray that you would be our teacher today and that you would use him and give him the exact words that you would have for him. And that you would meet each of us, God, as we participate, as we listen, as we engage with the content. And help form us as the leaders and church members and followers of you that you would have us be as we consider missional living in the future. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, all you, Stuart.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join you. Saturate is new to me. I hadn't heard of it before I got the email from Ben, so interesting to connect with a new community and a network. I have been to the States quite a number of times over the past 25 years, but actually not for a number of years recently. So I'm here to learn as well as to share. I don't know what's been going on over the last few years, and I suspect things may have changed since I was last there. So it's not going to be a one-way question and answer. I hope it'll be a mutual learning thing. Let me see if I can share my screen at this point. Hopefully that can now be seen. So Ben has asked me to spend a little bit of time introducing this strange term post-Christendom, to say a little bit about what it means and what are some of the implications for us in relation to church and mission. So I'm planning to speak for maybe about 15 minutes, and then we'll go into some conversation and questions. So my perspective is that we are, throughout Western culture, living through a time of very significant culture shift. And that culture shift is complex, it's varied, there are all kinds of ways in which our culture is changing, and it's affecting our lifestyle, our priorities, our ways of looking at the world, our ways of thinking. And post-Christendom is only one of quite a number of different aspects of culture shift. It's the one we're going to focus on today, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one that's significant. And in fact, post-Christendom is just one of a number of words beginning with post that commentators on our culture shift are using. And I'm trying, if I can, to get the next slide up, but it doesn't seem to want to shift. Let me try again. Try that. Yes, okay. I'm a bit of a technophobe, so this may or may not work. But I'm sure you've come across a variety of post words that commentators use to describe some of the changes taking place in our culture. Perhaps the most familiar is postmodern, but we also hear about post-industrial, post-secular, post-feminist, and many, many more. Sadly, one of the newer post words on both sides of the Atlantic is post-truth. And we're wondering what it means to be people of the truth in a post-truth world. And the prefix post that begins all these words simply means afterwards. It is not forward-looking, it's backward-pointing. It's not telling us where we're going, it's basically saying we're not where we used to be. And to that extent, these post words are limited in their value because they don't give us much insight about what might be emerging. They're humble words. They're a way of saying, actually, we don't really know what's coming, but they signal to us that we're going through a time of change. We are not where we used to be. We can no longer describe our culture, our society, our worldview in the way that we used to. And that in itself, I think, is quite a helpful warning. In a time of change that is complex and still in flux, it means that our missional responses will need to be provisional rather than fixed. They'll need to be flexible and they'll need to be responsive. And so the very fact that we don't know where we're going, that we're using all these post words to describe our situation, is quite a helpful warning to us. So I want to focus particularly on this one word, post-Christendom, one of these many shifts that are taking place in our culture. And this is a definition that I've been working with for the last 20 years or so that seems to have gathered fairly widespread acceptance in many places. It's a bit bulky, it's a bit wordy, but as you'll know, some of the language, some of the sentences used by Paul and others in the New Testament is also quite wordy. He doesn't seem to mind having long sentences, so I think I'm allowed one at least. So post-Christendom is the culture that emerges as the Christian faith loses coherence within a society that has been definitively shaped by the Christian story, and as the institutions that have been developed to express Christian convictions decline in influence. Yeah, there's quite a lot wrapped up in that. But essentially, we're talking about a situation where our culture has been definitively shaped by the Christian story over many centuries. It's not the only story. There have been a number of other stories that have had an influence, but it's the Christian story that has been most influential and most definitive. And what is happening in our culture is that fewer and fewer people know that story, or believe that story, or are shaped by that story. And that is making a huge difference to individuals, to communities, to neighborhoods, and to our whole culture. And it has all kinds of knock-on effects for Christian institutions, churches, and many other institutions. We are going through quite a significant time of culture shift and of having to reimagine what it means to be followers of Jesus in a changing world. And the language of post-Christendom, like all the other posts, is not a description of where we have got to or where we're going. It is simply saying we're not where we used to be. And so it's a word that's all about transition. And so I want to very briefly just take you through 7 transitions that seem to me to be indicative of some of the changes we're aware of. Now, yes, as Ben said, I'm speaking from a UK or European context, and you'll have to tell me whether you feel that these transitions are as evident and as well developed as we certainly feel they are here. Post-Christendom is emerging at different rates in different places, and it looks different. So it's a kind of catch-all phrase. There are different kinds of post-Christendom. Post-Protestant and post-Catholic Christendoms are very different. In some places, Christendom has disintegrated very rapidly. In other places, such as England, it's been a very gradual process. And that affects all kinds of things in terms of our perception and our responses to that. But I think there's enough in common still to use the language of post-Christendom, to say that there is something generic here that is worth being aware of. So that the first obvious transition is from the center to the margins, that for hundreds of years in Europe and for a shorter period in North America, the Christian story and the church have been very much at the center of culture. Certainly in a European context, we now recognize that we're on the margins. We're no longer at the center. We are now marginal, and our influence is very different from what it used to be. We were the great majority. For many centuries in Europe, Christians were the overwhelming majority. There were minorities, but we were the overwhelming majority. And we are now in transition to becoming a minority. And that raises all sorts of questions: theological, ideological, practical, financial, all sorts of things. And what's particularly significant about it is not that we are now a minority community. There are lots of cities in the world where Christians have only ever been a minority. What's significant is that we're an ex-majority minority. And there aren't very many places like that. And that raises all sorts of different questions than if you'd always been a minority. We might want to explore that a bit. The third transition I've described as from settlers to sojourners. In a Christendom world shaped by our story, where we were at the center, we felt very much at home. This is our place. This is our culture. In a post-Christendom world, we don't feel the same. We feel more like sojourners, travelers, aliens, exiles, pilgrims. Those sorts of words are being used a lot to describe the church in Western culture. It's unsettling. From privilege to plurality. Well, when we were the great majority, when we were at the center, understandably, we had enormous privileges. And we have been losing those at a rate of knots over quite a number of decades now. And rightly so, because we are now a minority in a plural culture. Why should we be privileged beyond others in a plural society? And yet there's a sense of loss. There's a sense of threat. We're losing our way. We're losing our privileges. And for many, there's a sense of grief, and for some, a sense of anger about that, and resilience, a resistance. And from control to witness. Christendom really was a controlled society. It was quite totalitarian. You really weren't meant to believe all the right things and behave in the right way and belong to the right institutions. And if you didn't, if you were a dissident, you were in real difficulty. Christendom was not a good place to be if you were a dissident. Control was exercised. And of course, we're way beyond that in most Western societies. And we're thrown back on the much earlier and I think much more authentic approach, which is witness, telling a story, living out that story, inviting others to consider that story. Now, I would suggest that those first 5 transitions are well established in all the Western societies that I'm most familiar with, and that there's no obvious way of turning the clock back. These are not temporary blips, and we can go back to where we used to be in some way. I would suggest that they're well established, and this is describing where we're going to be for the foreseeable future. The last 2 transitions, which I'll put up together, are somewhat different from the first 5. These are responses rather than things we observe. In the light of those first 5 transitions, what does it mean for us to be followers of Jesus today? And one of the suggestions is that we need to make a significant shift in all aspects of our Christian community, from maintenance to mission. And that we need to move away from a primary understanding of church as institution to church as movement. And we'll come back to have a look at what those might mean in just a moment. So I guess I want to ask you the question, and you can respond as we take some time later on. Do you recognize these transitions? How far advanced are they in your community? In previous visits to North America, it has seemed to me that it's varied quite markedly in different places. In some perhaps more urban centers, I haven't really detected a great deal of difference from the European scene. In some more rural and suburban communities, it's almost felt like a Christendom world still. And so it may be that those of you who are coming in from different places to this webinar today have very different experiences, and it'd be good to share some of those as we go through. There are also some who argue that America is an exception, that America is not experiencing post-Christendom in the way that Europe and other Western societies is. Now, for some people, that will be because of the constitutional separation of church and state. How can you have a Christendom system when you have that constitutional separation? I would simply want to say that I think Christendom can take many forms and is remarkably adaptable. And whatever the official line, Christendom seems to find a way of intruding into the realities of the situation. Others would say, well, no, things are different here. Not only have we never really had a Christendom, but we might be heading towards one. Actually, we might be becoming a more Christian nation, or at least that's our vision, that's our hope. There are certainly some who are strongly advocating Christendom as the best possible scenario for the future. And what we need to do is to try to shore up the foundations and to make sure that Christians are able, as far as possible, to continue to control society. Haven't quite given up on the shift from control to witnesses yet. But I think the observation of a growing number of people is that the realities that we're talking about here, these transitions, are becoming more and more obvious in all parts of North America. I'm much more familiar in recent years with Canada, which I think is somewhere between Europe and America in terms of these transitions. And it may simply be that the journey that you're on is the same journey that we've been on a couple of decades ago. And so I think conversations across the Atlantic are very helpful in both directions. So post-Christendom, I would suggest, implies both institutional and ideological transitions. The churches and other Christian organizations are becoming increasingly marginal in size and influence. Significantly fewer people, particularly younger people, now know the Christian story or understand Christian language or recognize Christian symbols. And that is new. That is new for centuries. It's been centuries since we've been able to say those sorts of things. And we are now surrounded by a whole range of both religious and secular philosophies competing for influence in the space that was once dominated by Christianity. We have competitors in a way we're not used to. And in the light of some of these changes, as followers of Jesus and as churches, we need to renegotiate our relationship with the surrounding culture. So post-Christendom, I would suggest, is both a demanding and an invigorating mission context. And I want us to think for the rest of the few moments that I have about the missional implications of this. It's important, I think, we get beyond analysis to saying, well, so what? What does it actually mean in practice? I've already started to indicate one or two things by pointing to those last two transitions, from maintenance to mission and from institution to movement. Please hear me carefully here. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with institutions or with maintenance. If anything wants to survive more than one generation, you have to put in some kind of institutional framework and you have to attend to maintenance. These are not swear words. These are good things. The difficulty is when they become dominant and stifling, when they become so preeminent that they squeeze out any sense of movement or of mission. And that's the shift that I'm interested in talking about. It's not an either or, it's a recalibrating. It's a re-emphasizing of one rather than the other. And I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. So my argument would be that in the Christendom centuries, ecclesiology preceded missiology. That we first of all started with our understanding of church, and then we asked, well, what then is the church meant to do? And so missiology effectively was a department of church, or was a program of church. And in a settled institutional situation, that seemed to make some sense. Although actually for much of the centuries in the heartlands of Christendom, mission almost disappeared. If you assume that everybody around you almost is Christian, if you assume that you live in a Christian culture, well, what is mission? And so mission became something that just a few enthusiasts did beyond the boundaries of Christendom. You know, those people who are awkward in your church, well, you send them off as missionaries somewhere else and they can do their thing over there. And the rest of us haven't got to bother. That simply won't do in a post-Christendom world where we need to reverse the polarities, where we need to start with missiology and then ask, in the light of that, what is our ecclesiology? We don't start with the church, we start with the mission of God and ask, well, how does the church fit into that? And I suspect you've probably heard before this rather catchy phrase, God's church does not have a mission, but God's mission has a church. And if you want the Latin term missio Dei, which has become increasingly popular in the last 20 years or so, the argument is that mission doesn't begin with us, it begins with God. God is the missionary, and God invites us to participate in God's mission. And as a resource for God's mission, we have God's church. And that's a pretty fundamental theological shift. And I would argue that Missio Dei is effectively a post-Christendom missiology, and that we need to communicate that clearly within our churches. It's something which started very much in the academic world, has become familiar, I think, to church leaders, but is still relatively unknown in ordinary church circles. And I think that's something that we need to address. I don't mean that we need to use the Latin phrase, but I do think we need to grapple with the realities of what it implies. So just a few suggestions then before we go into some conversation. What might mission in post-Christendom imply? What might it look like? I think the first thing I'd want to say, and we can pick up any of these in more detail in a moment, is that I think we do need to understand mission in post-Christendom as thoroughly cross-cultural. Not just because there are people from other religious communities around us, but because the shift in our culture is so significant and so varied that wherever we are, whatever we're doing, we need to think like cross-cultural missionaries. And the vast majority of Christian leaders don't. The vast majority of Christian training in the West doesn't do that. It doesn't equip people for cross-cultural mission. It's still assuming a fundamentally Christian culture. And that will continue to disable us until we make some changes there. A second thing that I think is becoming more and more obvious, again, I'd be interested to know how far this has got in your context, is that in terms of evangelism, in terms of sharing faith and telling the Jesus story, we simply have to start further back. We can no longer assume that people know anything. Some do, of course, and sometimes we can be surprised at what people know, but we can also be very surprised at what they don't know. I have a rather strange collection of post-Christendom anecdotes, stories that indicate just how far back we have to start, just how little knowledge there is of anything remotely to do with the Christian story. And that, again, can be quite disabling if we don't understand that, because we can expect people to respond far more quickly than they're likely to. They will need more time to understand what it is we're talking about. And so our evangelism strategies need to change in terms of their starting point and the time frame. For most people, it's going to take much longer than we're used to. Church planting, I, as Ben said, have been involved personally in church planting now for nearly 40 years and remain very much committed to it, but only to certain kinds of church planting. The kind of church planting we need is not simply more of the same. It's not simply more churches. We need to be rethinking what does church look like in a changing culture? What remains the same? What treasures do we bring with us from Christendom? And what baggage do we leave behind? Church planting seems to me to be absolutely essential because it's one of the ways in which we can experiment. It's one of the opportunities that pioneers have to do things without getting into trouble, or at least not too much trouble. If you try and do too many different things in an established church, you begin to hit all sorts of issues and problems and concerns. Church planting is a place for pioneers to experiment. And what's important about that kind of experimenting is that the pioneers and the rest of us keep in touch so that we're learning together. Solidarity, what I mean by that is that in a post-Christendom world where we are now on the margins, solidarity with other marginal groups may be really quite important. In the Christendom world, the church primarily associated with the movers and the shakers, with those at the top of the pile. I suspect in post-Christendom, we're going to need to learn to identify more with the moved and the shaken, with those who are at the bottom of the pile. Not just because we are also now on the margins, but because there is a gospel priority to that, and something which I think has been occluded during the Christendom years, but now perhaps is coming into focus again. And we'll need to think a bit about missional equipping. What does it mean to equip one another, to equip our communities to be missional? And again, there are many things that we could talk about here. It certainly won't be enough just to say, oh, we're a missional church. That language won't do. It's got to be worked out in practice. I suspect it'll mean, for example, introducing into our gatherings regular opportunities to encourage people to reflect theologically on their vocations. What does it mean to be followers of Jesus, missional followers of Jesus in all walks of life? I think it'll mean ordaining people, far, far more people than we've ordained so far, not as church ministers, but as teachers, as engineers, as nurses, as cleaners, ordaining people to their God-given place of mission and ministry. Let's lay hands on lots of people. I'm not particularly committed to a clerical view of the church, but I'm all for ordination. Let's ordain everybody as far as possible. and recognize that actually that's where most of the work takes place. Missional equipping is far more about equipping people to do things beyond the church than to take up responsibilities within it. I could say a lot more, but I don't want to erode too much into our time for conversation. Post-Christendom can be seen, I think, either as an enormous threat or as a wonderful opportunity. You might, from my tone of voice, already get some idea of where I'm coming from. But there are certainly some who seem to me to be doing what the ostrich is famed for doing, digging its head in the sand, looking around when it decides to pop up again, and to see if it can find a few examples of growing churches that might persuade us that we can carry on doing what we've always done, looking for plug-in-and-play programs, desperately hoping for a revival that will turn the clock back. Post-Christendom is not an easy scenario. It's a demanding context, and I can understand why many Christians and many churches seem to have adopted that kind of stance. I don't think it's helpful, but I think it's certainly understandable. My perspective, and maybe this is where we can begin the conversation, is rather different. I want to suggest that actually post-Christendom is a fantastic opportunity. That this is a really exciting time to be a follower of Jesus, to be engaged in mission. I think we have an opportunity to put behind us and to repent of some of the ways in which Christendom distorted the gospel. The church was colluding for so many centuries with wealth and power and status and violence. This is an opportunity to begin to break free of that. We have an opportunity today to rejoice that all those who decide to become followers of Jesus do so without compulsion and without inducement. Those who belong to church today in a post-Christendom culture, by and large, want to be there. We may be smaller than we used to be, but at least we know who we are. And I think that's an advantage. I think there are real advantages in the Christian story becoming unfamiliar. We may grieve that in some ways, but actually we have the opportunity that missionaries haven't had for hundreds of years in Western culture of telling the story to people who've never heard it. And that should get the evangelistic juices flowing. I think it's also an opportunity for us to rediscover Jesus ourselves, the radical Jesus, not the civic religion Jesus that has been masquerading for so long. I think we can look at all sorts of issues in a fresh way now that we are no longer under imperial Christianity. All sorts of issues, I think, will be reimagined and explored in fresh ways. That's quite exciting. And I think it will be interesting to see what we learn on the margins. As you read the Bible, at least as I read the Bible, it seems to me that God is always at work on the margins. In fact, that's normally where you find God, not at the center of things, but on the edge, in the unexpected and surprising places. And as we find ourselves now on the margins, we might just bump into God there, find God doing things and join in. Who knows? The other picture, I'll finish with this, is the idea really that we're just beginning to see evidence of new life, breaking through the hard ground. There are just beginning to be indications that we're learning how to be followers of Jesus in post-Christendom. But it's not revival. It's not harvest time. It's not even time to water the seeds. It may not even be time to plant them. It may just be time to break up the hard ground of our culture. I think we're in it for the long haul. But there are perhaps just enough indications, just enough encouragements to suggest to us that we're beginning to learn a little bit about what it means to follow Jesus into this strange new world, what it means to engage in mission in this new environment. So I've thrown quite a lot at you, and you may well have questions, comments, reflections, disagreements, which is fine. Ben encouraged me just to share a few resources on a final slide, so I'll put that up there for the moment. The book that he referred to, Post-Christendom, was actually published in 2004, so it's 16 years old now. There is a revised version that came out a year or two ago, which I've tried to update a little bit. And I've actually tried to reflect a little bit more on the North American scene. Wisely or not, I'm not sure. You can have to tell me. And it's the first in a series of books under the rubric After Christendom. 13 of those have been published so far by a variety of authors. There are 7 more on the way. This is an attempt to ask in all kinds of areas, what does it mean now to be after Christendom? How does that affect all kinds of aspects of discipleship, church, and mission? And then just 2 or 3 websites, the Anabaptist Network that I'm part of, the Urban Expression missional agency that I'm part of, Crucible course, which is our training program, which is fundamentally a post-Christendom training course for missional pioneers. And just in case you want something that is rather more rooted in North America than I am, I've had some connection with McMaster Divinity School in Canada, and they've been producing for the last few years a journal of post-Christendom studies, which might be helpful as you follow this through in a North American context. I'll stop.
Thank you. And I'll just mention the Crucible course, which is the second to last link there. There's one of those that Stuart shot over to me last week that dives deeper into this specific topic after Christendom, post-Christendom, that starts here in next week, I guess, the 6th of October. And so if that's of interest beyond what, a 20-minute overview could provide, then that could be a great next step that we would, recommend and point to on Stuart's behalf. So I love how you ended with the opportunity versus the threat, because so many people can look at those shifts that you mentioned and see them as a loss or a discouragement. But that was one of the things that stuck out to me when I first read your book, not quite 16 years ago, but a little far back, because you didn't see it as a threat or a loss. You mentioned even in the book some of the opportunities that you mentioned today, and even how the center from the margins, the majority to the minority, even takes us back to first century pre-Christendom. So I wonder if you might note a little bit of that. How does what's coming take us back to what used to be?
Yeah, I've got into trouble sometimes for being too enthusiastic about post-Christendom, and for perhaps with a lack of pastoral sensitivity, ignoring the sense of grief and loss that people feel. And I have learned over the years to acknowledge that actually this is a difficult time for many churches and communities. I think there is actually a bereaving process that probably many need to go through. But I hope we can get through that and then begin to see something of the opportunities and the joy actually of post-Christendom. And yet in some ways it takes us back to pre-Christendom, other ways it doesn't. I think it's something we need to be careful about. Pre-Christendom didn't have 1600 years of Christendom on its back. We do. We can't suddenly unlearn that or uninvent it. And one of the issues we face is that, well, in our context anyway, we find that people know quite a bit about the dark side of Christendom. They may not know much of the Jesus story, but they know about Inquisition and Crusades and witch hunts and persecution by Christians of others. And we sometimes need to grapple with that. That can be quite a barrier. But in other ways, I think, yes, it does take us back to being a minority community in a plural culture. I think there's lots we can learn from the early church and also from other minority communities elsewhere, if we have the grace and the humility to do that.
Yeah, and other folks, feel free to ask your questions as well. I've got a whole litany from learning from Stuart's writing over the years, but I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to ask your questions too. On that note, though, Stuart, as others populate with their questions, we talked a lot about kind of the theory and trajectory. Some folks who are participating in our webinars are certainly church leaders, and others are, just trying to be faithful followers of Jesus, who are the nurses and they are the engineers and the cleaners that you mentioned. Is there a difference, or how would you encourage, church leaders to respond, not versus everyday followers of Jesus, but as you think about that, what are some encouragements you would give both populations?
Well, I think it's quite interesting trying to answer that question in the light of all the COVID restrictions, where church leaders have, in my experience, been floundering, wondering what on earth to do if you can no longer run the program on a Sunday, which has been the focal point for so many years. And I think it is an opportunity to reimagine and reprioritize aspects of church. Church as community, church as a supportive community, church not as the be-all and end-all, but as the community from which mission operates in the whole of society. I think a complaint that has often been voiced, and there's plenty of research evidence to back it up, is that the vast majority of people learn almost nothing from their Sunday sermons about the life of work. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus at work? Apart from don't steal the paper clips and take every opportunity you can to mention Jesus. That just won't do. We need a much more holistic, a much more incarnational approach, which asks, how can I participate in the mission of God in my workplace, in my neighborhood, in my leisure activities, and the whole of life. It's a whole life discipleship thing that we need to be modeling and advocating. And I think that's going to mean a very significant shift for many church leaders, for whom often it's about drawing people into church activities, asking people to be more committed to what the church is doing. And there are certain things that church should be doing and does do. But this balance between the gathered church and the scattered church, it seems to me, will need to shift quite significantly. And it may just be that this pandemic is giving us a breathing space to ask, what would that look like? What do we actually need to do in order to be a resource community for the mission of God?
That's good. Continuing that same line, you and I chatted a little bit last week of kind of separatism versus engagement, and yeah, what would be a good way to pursue some of that?
I've learned a lot from the Scottish missiologist Andrew Walls. I don't know whether he's well known at all in North America, but he has done a remarkable amount of research on how the mission of the church has evolved over the centuries. And he talks about two principles. What he calls them the Indigenizing principle and the Pilgrim Principle. That sounds a bit threatening, that language, but essentially what he's saying is that one of the glories of the gospel is that it is translatable. It can be translated into any language, any culture. We do not have a holy language. For Islam, Arabic is a holy language. Really, the Quran is untranslatable. That's not a Christian perspective on Scripture. Scripture can be translated into any language, any culture. And so indigenizing the gospel is a significant part of our mission. What does it mean for the gospel to take roots in Texas? What is good news in Texas? Now, the other principle is the Pilgrim Principle. And the Pilgrim Principle is where he says, well, actually, through the centuries, the church has been a pilgrim people and will need to continue to be faithful to the story that it has carried all the way through those centuries. So we're not at liberty to invent a new gospel, but nor are we bound to present the gospel in ways that we have in the past in different cultures. Now, again, that's pretty normal stuff for cross-cultural missionaries, but it's still something in the Western context that is relatively unfamiliar. And if you begin to use different language to talk about the gospel, some of your brothers and sisters get a bit frightened. You know, is this heresy? Is this unorthodox? And so finding a balance between creativity and orthodoxy, I think, is going to be really important. So that's one take on the engaged and separate thing. There are many other things too.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's not just a talk about the gospel, but even the creativity of what a church looks like.
Sure.
You mentioned how hard it is to come out of being a majority into a minority, and I have to assume some of the difficulty there is everybody has, even if it's just a view they've seen on movies of a Roman Catholic service or this kind of stuff, everybody has some view of what a church is supposed to be. Whereas you see so much creativity in cross-cultural missions, or even in the early church, we don't have a lot of glimpses, but those we do seem to be a lot of creativity and a lot of obviously very spirit-ledness there. Is that some of what you meant by having?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the issue is probably less images of the church in wider culture and more to do with the expectations of church culture.
Right. Yeah.
So it seems one of the challenges of moving from majority to minority is that very often churches are simply too busy. They've got a program that is designed for a much larger community and for a very different kind of context. And there's a need to reimagine what actually needs to be done. So I think many of the problems are not in terms of the image of the church from outside, they're actually to do with the image of the church from inside, and that needs to shift quite significantly. But I do think it's about gospel as well as church. I think it's relatively unthreatening to do church in different ways. And there's a variety of creative expressions of church happening all over Western culture, which is good news. But to ask the more theological questions can be much more threatening. What actually is the good news? What is it that Jesus saves us from, for, and to? And theologically, how do we understand what's going on in Western culture? Where is God in this? Have we failed God? Is that why we're now a minority? Has God failed us? And even to ask those questions is pushing the boundaries in terms of what many churches will be prepared to consider. But I just think we need to have some of those questions on the agenda because they're there. People are asking those questions in our congregations, even if leaders don't want to vocalize them.
Yeah, that's good. Question from Raul. You mentioned you'd only be involved in certain types of church planting. Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, I guess in two ways in particular. One of those is that I'm not convinced that we will gain much by simply replicating the kinds of churches we already have many of. That doesn't mean that we can never do that. There may be some situations where another church of the same kind makes sense. But it's really asking for, the two words that I would focus on are creative and contextual. Can we be a bit more creative? Ask what actually are the essentials of church, and other ways of doing them differently that might make more sense, and what makes sense in a particular context. So I've worked with church planters for over 40 years, and some of them are wonderfully creative, but don't seem to pay enough attention to context. And so what they're actually creating is something that they like, but doesn't make any sense where they are. It's got to be both. It's got to be both contextual and creative. And it won't do, I think, just to change the kind of outward appearance of church. There has to be something to do with values and the kind of inner ethos of church. That's more important in many ways than the outward. Not meeting at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening and serving donuts. Well, okay, but it's not that exciting. It's not that radical, and it probably isn't going to produce remarkable church growth in your community. We need to find more creative, more radical, more experimental ways of doing it, and to allow those to feed back then into the wider church. I've always advocated a view of church planting that it's not just about the local initiative. It's pioneering on behalf of the whole church. It's, well, let me dare to use an American analogy, that, when gradually you were pushing out across this enormous continent of yours and sending out scouts ahead of you, to see what was over the next hill, that was really important because you don't know what's over the next hill. It might be dangerous or it might be good. But it's no use at all if the scouts you send out never come back. If they just keep going. They need to come back and tell you what's over there. And for me, pioneering church planting is a bit like that. It's going out ahead on behalf of the whole community to say, look, we found this and we've tried that and we've done that. What do you think? And some of what they do will be crazy and you wouldn't want to repeat it. And some of it may be really significant for the future. But it's the conversations between the new and the old that I think are going to be critical for our future.
Yeah. And to flesh that same image out a little bit, if folks think that they're taking a new hill and they have the same, tools and methods that they used to take the previous hill, but only they discover, oh, it's not a hill, it's a mountain, this kind of stuff. That's some of what you're saying is don't just copy what you used to do, or don't look at what worked in Seattle or worked in New York or worked for this particular leader or this kind of stuff, but rather, or in the I don't know if that's as prevalent in the UK, but
oh yes, yeah.
Love, and we try to do exactly what they did and expect the same results. Yeah.
I mean, be inspired by the stories. We need stories to inspire us. We need to learn and to listen, but it's not about replication. It's not about finding a program. It's about, God, what are you saying to me and to this community here? How do we incarnate the good news in a community in this neighborhood?
Yeah. What are some of the ways that you've seen some of those church plants take form? What are some of the creative ways, again, with the caveat of these are only examples and inspiring stories?
Sure.
Nobody gets to just follow what Stuart's about to say.
Good. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And well, a number of things. I think one of the recognitions over the last 20 years has been that for many people, networks are at least as important as neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So the traditional church model is a neighborhood model. You have a building in a particular area and you see the neighborhood around you as your parish or whatever language you want to use, but there is a geographical community that you're trying to engage with. And I'm not in any way dismissing that. That will still be, I think, a very normal form of church going forward, whatever that church looks like. But a lot of people operate through social networks, through relational networks, through work networks. And I've been interested to see quite a number of creative examples of trying to plant into networks rather than simply into neighborhoods. And to ask, what would it look like to have a church among people who share something in common, which isn't geography? Perhaps they share, they all work in the same industry. Perhaps they all enjoy the same kind of sport. Perhaps they all enjoy the same kind of music. Now, there are dangers in that, because you can then sort of split off the church into lots of tiny interest groups. But I think missionally, it's really important that we find ways of penetrating networks as well as neighborhoods. It's a both and, again, it's not an either or. But I think that's been where some of the more creative church planting that I've seen has been evident.
Yeah. As far as leadership, even within that, have you seen a distinction between, you mentioned the idea of ordaining everybody, which is a beautiful image, or ordaining as many people as we can. But often ordination, at least in North America, is still tied to paycheck and vocation. Have you seen that continue to be as tied together in post-Christendom, or is there a growing creativity there as well?
A growing number of pioneers are self-financing. Sometimes that's because they can't find any funding, because they're doing things that are a bit crazy and their denominationals won't back them. Sometimes it's because they choose to be self-funding so as not to be dependent on denominational support. And quite honestly, our denominations are running out of money. We have far less money than we used to have. The difficulty also is that in our context, at least, it takes much longer to plant a church than it used to. So I do quite a lot of consulting with different denominational leaders and talking with them about what kind of funding might be appropriate for church planting. I will normally say to them, well, look, if you're serious about funding this church planter, please invest for 10 years. 10 years of funding. Yeah. And then they look at the figures and they jaws drop and they think, oh, that's an enormous amount of money. But otherwise, you get into the situation where you get 3 years of funding, at the end of which the expectation is that a church will have been planted that can now fund the pioneer. And in almost every context that I know, in Western Europe at least, that just isn't going to happen. It just takes much longer. So realistically, we're moving into an era of self-funding pioneering, and probably increasingly into self-funding leadership generally. I don't think we're going to be able to retain the paid minister model indefinitely for most people.
Just for unity in the spirit, you're the third person I've heard in the past few weeks talk about how 10 years is the new 3 years. As goes, and the other two are in North America, so maybe we're further along in some of those shifts than some participants might realize. Related, the one of the questions came in from Ryan. Time may be the most coveted thing in the North American context, maybe the most coveted resource. How have you seen discipleship and mission bear fruit in post-Christendom as it relates to that resource, the limited time we all have?
Again, I'm interested to see what difference this pandemic and the restrictions make, because my perception is that most churches that I know are too busy. Most of them require too much investment of time from people who are already busy. And that many of them just need to free up time for people to be involved more missionally in their neighborhoods and communities. I just don't think we need to do all that we do as often as we do it. So I think we do need to ask some questions about essentials. How many sermons do you need a month, really? The average, I suppose, is at least one a week. Some churches still with 2. My question is, well, why not have one really, really good sermon at the beginning of the month and spend the rest of the month trying to work out what it means in practice, in the neighborhood, in small groups? Why just keep on preaching at people and seeing so little result of that? Again, the research evidence is pretty discouraging for preachers. The amount of even remembering what was said. There was some research done a little while ago where people were asked on the way out of the Sunday morning service, what was the sermon about today? What were the main points? What was I meant to do about it? And a frightening number of people couldn't answer any of those questions. And that is deeply depressing for those who preach, but it's the reality. And I think we just need to reimagine how to equip people for missional discipleship. I've nothing against sermons as such, but I think they're one component where they're a much more varied diet that we need. And so doing fewer things really well, I think, would free up some time. The other thing is that I think the use of time is a choice. Now, that may sound harsh because I know, people with big families, with work commitments, working long hours in order to pay the mortgage or whatever, it'll feel like that's unfair. But even within that context, I think there are choices to be made as to what we spend our time doing. And I think it's also important, if we see mission not as yet another activity to bolt on to everything else we're doing, but as a lifestyle, then it doesn't actually take any more time. It is simply a way of reconfiguring our work, our leisure time, our family life, our neighborhood involvement. It's when mission becomes an extra thing, that's when I think the time pressure begins to kick in particular. So yeah, I'm throwing a whole number of things there. I don't deny that time is a real issue, but it is interesting at present with these pandemic restrictions. One of the things we're finding here, I mean, I live about an hour's train ride away from central London. A lot of people around me commute to London and have stopped commuting. They're working from home. And it's freed up an enormous amount of time. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of people go back. I think we're going to see increasingly work move closer to where people live. That could save 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, week after week. I mean, that's a huge bonus. So again, I take what you said earlier. I think the pandemic is shining a light on certain things that perhaps we should have looked at sooner.
There's a theme that continues to emerge in what you're saying. It's almost a shift from being calendar driven or program driven, whether looking into the church or encouraging the church to look outward, a shift from being program driven to being more relational driven, relationship driven. I don't know if that's an overstatement, but that's part of what I'm hearing you say consistently.
Yeah, I think so. And again, looking at the research into how people actually become followers of Jesus, how do people become Christians? The vast majority is through friendship. It's not primarily through programs. The programs have their place, but you look at all the research, and actually that's true, I think, across the globe, not just in Western culture. It's primarily through friendship. And so releasing one another, simply to make friends, simply to have quality time with people, I think is crucially important, as long as it doesn't become instrumental. As long as this term friendship evangelism is one of my pet hates, because it just sounds so inauthentic. Why am I going to be your friend? Because I'm waiting for an opportunity to hit you with the gospel. No, I want to be a friend because I want to be a friend. And because I'm a friend, I want to share with you what's important to me. That's quite different.
Yeah, that posture makes all the difference.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ephesians 4, apostles, prophets, evangelists, teachers, shepherds. How does that play into some of the creative church planting you're seeing in post-Christendom? That's one of the questions that came through.
Okay. Well, my suggestion would be that in the Christendom era, only two of those were functioning, the pastor and the teacher. That the church depended on pastors and teachers, trained pastors and teachers, validated pastors and teachers, paid pastors and teachers. We lost any sense of the role of the evangelist because we assumed it was a Christian culture. We lost largely the role of prophet because, well, if it's a Christian culture, prophets haven't got anything to say. And that's for apostles, whatever they are. Why would you want apostles anyway? They're always disturbing people. So I think one of the possibilities for post-Christendom is a recovery of apostles, prophets, and evangelists. But we need to make sure that we think quite carefully about what we understand those roles to be. It's certainly not hierarchical. It's not the apostle is the top of the tree and then prophet, and there's nothing of that sort. It's a spectrum of gifts and responsibilities. It's, if you like, spheres of ministry rather than levels of ministry. And we need to train them. We need to significantly shift our training institutions away from just training pastors and teachers to training evangelists, prophets, and apostles. There aren't many training courses for prophets and apostles around. I used to teach a module on that when I was teaching in the 90s, and my colleagues were outraged. You can't do that. Yes, you can. Yeah, they're just ministries like anything else. They need to be equipped. They need to be trained. They need to learn how their ministry fits in other ministries. So I think a broader based understanding of ministry is going to be really helpful for the future.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm aware of the time. This may be a big and bold question for you, but are there other lessons that, as you look at North America, and you were honest about not being here in the last few years, but you have experience and relationships across the pond as well. Are there other lessons you see us consistently ignoring, or to use your ostrich, burying our head in the sand, Are there things that we should be paying attention to in the UK and Europe that we're ignoring?
Yeah, I do feel somewhat reluctant to pontificate from over here, but I think one of the things that when I read American books by church leaders and mission thinkers, I would want to make a distinction, I think, between people who are unchurched and people who are dechurched. So, even though the language of unchurched is often used in American writings, very often, if you probe a little bit, it seems to me what people are talking about are people who are dechurched, who haven't been to church for a while, but whose parents were regular churchgoers. We here are in a very different position. Yes, there are some people like that, but we are now looking at 3 or 4 generations unchurched. So people who have never been anywhere near a church, nor are their parents, nor are their grandparents. They're a long, long, long way away from anything remotely churched or gospel. And that is coming to America. The number of people now who answer none when asked about their religious affiliation is growing year by year. And I think most of the missional literature that I read from America is still largely in a dechurched context rather than an unchurched or never church context. And that seems to me, again from a distance, that's something that has hardly begun to register yet, because it will mean a radically different approach to church and mission, I think. I think there are questions also about well, and I watch with interest, well, that's probably not the right word, what's going on politically. We're in a mess here, so I don't know how to describe what's going on there. But the sheer polarization, it seems to me, is a particular issue. And on issues of ethics, Christians are assumed to have certain views on certain issues and to be unconcerned about other issues. And I think that can be quite damaging. It seems to me that there is a need for a more holistic approach, which gets away from the right-wing, left-wing, conservative, liberal. There's a whole range of ethical issues that need to be addressed. And I tend, in the things that I read at least, and some of the conversations I'm involved in, to find the same polarization in American society and the churches. And I just don't think that's very helpful. But I'm reluctant to say much more than that from a safe distance.
To the point you made from a safe distance, that's right. But to the point you made earlier, even in a church and state separation culture or constitutional government, your point is that Christendom seeps into
absolutely.
We can't look at the American politics without seeing that even though church and state are separate, there's certainly been a tie, even if it's been an unofficial one. So that just proves the point you already mentioned earlier. So we're at the top of the hour. Any questions we should ask that we haven't asked? I'm sure there are many. Anything come to mind as the last thought, though?
Not really. I'd probably just underline one thing, which is that this is a fluid situation. It's complex, it's changing. We're going to have more questions than answers for quite some time. And there are some Christian traditions that are much keener on answers than questions. It's good to have everything neat and tidy, and it's just not going to be like that. And so a willingness to be provisional, to be experimental, to be generous to each other, actually recognizing that nobody has all the answers. We need to listen to one another, learn from each other, experiment with a few things. Don't worry about failure. I mean, things will not work. Okay, learn from them, move on. It's going to take time. We're going to be on this journey for quite some time. So patience is probably the key word.
And the fruit of the Spirit as well. So it's a good place to rest. Way more to dive into on all of these topics, and every shift could use a long conversation. But I'm so grateful for your time today, Stuart. For everybody else, we'll keep the conversation going in a few weeks. Linda Bergquist and Todd Engstrom are going to turn our attention to local churches of the future and helpful and unhelpful trends they're seeing in their engagement with church leaders. So in addition to registering for that webinar and finding past webinars, saturatetheworld.com has a lot of related resources, including loads of audio and visual and written tools for everyday missional life as we continue to shift into post-Christendom. And you can activate a free 5-day trial and explore all new courses that we just released, including several on everyday mission and discipleship at saturatetheworld.com as well. So I hope you'll join us for our October 20 Church of the Future webinar, but that's it for today. Stuart, again, thank you. Your writing and your thought and your boldness and sharing has blessed me for many years personally, and you've blessed us today. So thank you. And thank you all for spending part of your day with us.